We're familiar with the category of majors and minors. Someone comes out of the driving test, you ask them how they got on. 15 minors, but no majors, and they pass. The next week their friend does the test. Only 4 minors, but 1 major, and so they fail. 1 major fault in a driving test, and that is you. There are some things in the Christian life, there are some beliefs we can get wrong and still go to heaven. But this section of Luke's Gospel pictures 5 types of people who got major things wrong. Major things wrong about the person and the work of Jesus. This morning we looked again at Jesus' healing of the paralyzed man, or to be specific, the reaction of the religious leaders when Jesus declared his sins to be forgiven. We saw how they got so much right, but they got Jesus wrong. They got so much right. Chapter 5, verse 21. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And they're right. Only God can forgive sins. But what they can't see is that the reason Jesus can forgive sins is because Jesus is God. The second major mistake we looked at this morning was not realizing who Jesus came for, being outraged that the great physician was spending his time with sick people. As if someone who gave money to the building of a new hospital would be outraged to visit and find that it was full of sick people. What are they doing here? The Pharisees both trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 things that go hand in hand. They thought of themselves as righteous and treated others with contempt. Then the third and the final major mistake we looked at this morning was trying to fit Jesus into their existing boxes, being scandalized that Jesus' disciples didn't fast. They fasted over 100 times a year extra. They were only required to fast once a year, but they added on an extra 104 times or so, twice a week. And that became the standard by which they measured others. Not what God says, not do they do it the once a year they're meant to, but do they do it the 104 times a year or 105 times a year that we do. So their addition soon becomes the standard. But new wine doesn't go into old wineskins. A new patch can't be sewn on an old garment. After church this morning, James gave me a good illustration of this today. A disruptor is a person or a company or a technology that fundamentally changes an industry or a market by challenging established norms. And in that sense, Jesus was a disruptor, challenging the established norms, not of God's word, because that's what he was calling people back to, but the established norms of the corrupt and rotten religious establishment. So towards the end of chapter 5, we've seen those who got most things right but got Jesus wrong. We've seen those who didn't realize who Jesus came for. And we've seen those who tried to fit Jesus into existing boxes. And as we begin chapter 6, this theme continues. We see 2 more major mistakes about Jesus in these verses. And the first one, which is number 4 overall, but point 1 for tonight, is not realizing who Jesus is. Not realizing who Jesus is. If you've done the Christianity Explored course, you might remember one of the illustrations that the presenter, Rico Tice, uses. And I always smile at it when I'm doing Christianity Explored with someone and we come across this section. Rico tells a story about a time he'd agreed to meet someone in a restaurant and he was standing there waiting for them to turn up. Rico's a minister in London. And while he was sort of standing there waiting, nothing else to do, there was a man sort of standing there along with him who looked vaguely familiar. They both stood there in silence for a few minutes until a group of people came up to the other person and said, "Okay, William, it's time to go." And straight away, he knew who it was. Any guesses, boys and girls? This man called William, who looked strangely familiar, well, it was Prince William. Obviously, Rico dines in fancier establishments than most of us, but talk about a missed opportunity. He could have spoken to his future king. He could have shared the gospel with him, but he didn't realize who he was, and he lost his opportunity. Well, the mistake we see here in the first 5 verses of chapter 6 is not realizing who Jesus is. This incident and the next one, they both take place on the Sabbath day. The day when God's people are meant to set aside for rest and worship. And the criticism is that the disciples are breaking the Sabbath by plucking the heads of grain as they walk past. Now, according to Deuteronomy, what the disciples were doing was actually lawful. It was fine. It was allowed by God's law. Deuteronomy 23:25, if you go into your neighbour's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbour's standing grain. So you can walk through your neighbour's field and pick some ears of grain to snack on as you go through, but you can't drive a tractor through and start trying to harvest it. But the rabbis had decided, well, yes, that's fine on the other 6 days, but it's not fine on the Sabbath, because even picking it is the same as harvesting. It's work. But that was something the rabbis had decided. God hadn't said that. And that's an important point to get. Jesus isn't here rejecting or questioning God's law. Because if Jesus hadn't perfectly kept God's law, then he would have been a sinner, and there would have been no chance of us getting to heaven. So if we read these verses and conclude that Jesus broke the Sabbath, we'd be in big trouble, because we would not have a Saviour who had fulfilled the law on our behalf. But while he's not rejecting or questioning God's law, Jesus is rejecting their add-ons to God's law. And there's a big difference. To support his argument, he appeals to the Scriptures. He says, have you not read? So he knows 1 Samuel 21 that we read earlier, that they would be familiar with it. And in verses 25 and 26, he appeals to the example of David, or sorry, that's the wrong verse. Numbers, verses 3 and 4. He appeals to the example of David, who ate the consecrated bread that was only meant for the priests. That incident that we read is just after, if you know the story of David and Jonathan, they go out and shoot arrows. It's a way for Jonathan to pass on a message to David that his father, King Saul, is determined to kill him, and David better run away. So David is in a desperate situation. He's had to run away. He goes to Ahimelech the priest, and he's not exactly honest about why he came. He says he's on a secret mission for the king, when actually he's running away from the king. Bible characters are not perfect. But he comes and he asks for 5 loaves of bread. But all Ahimelech has is the bread that was placed in the tabernacle before the Lord as part of God's worship. And then that bread would be taken away and replaced. And the bread that was taken away, the priests could eat that, their families could eat that. But David and his men, they weren't priests, so they weren't meant to eat it. So why does Ahimelech the priest give it to them? Well, in short, because human need takes priority over ceremonial law. Human need takes priority over ceremonial law. In other words, it wasn't morally wrong to give David the bread. It wasn't a breach of the Ten Commandments. In the same way, perhaps, as in all normal circumstances, I wouldn't stop in the middle of a sermon and make a phone call. But if someone was having a heart attack and I needed to phone an ambulance, I would. Or normally it would be wrong for two people in the pew sitting beside each other to be talking about something that was nothing to do with the sermon. But if it's one person tapping the other on the shoulder and saying, I think that person in front of us is about to faint, no one's going to say that it's sinful. It's something that's not normally done, but it is good even to do in these circumstances, that there are exceptions. So Jesus isn't here saying in verse 3 that, well, David broke God's law, so I can break God's law too. No, not at all. Regulations about the bread were part of the ceremonial law for worship. But in times of necessity, mercy was more important than observing the ceremonial law. The high priest at the time made sure that David and his men were ceremonially pure and gave them the bread. So while there were exceptional circumstances, there isn't any indication in the Old Testament that what David and his men did was sinful. The ceremonial law was temporarily set aside, but the moral law, summarized in the Ten Commandments, wasn't broken. And so Jesus is saying that if David could do that, if David could bypass one of God's regulations, how much more could Jesus ignore the rabbi's additions to God's law? Because Jesus is greater than David. In fact, verse 5, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who invented it, and so he has the right to clear away all the man-made additions to it. But the Pharisees don't recognize who Jesus is. They don't recognize that by doing this, he's claiming to have greater authority than even David had. Jesus doesn't come along and change God's laws, but he comes along and removes all the human additions to it. Like when they come to him about divorce, and he says, "Have you not read how it was at the beginning?" He's always pointing them back to God's original plan. So he's claiming in what he says to be greater than David. And the tragic thing about all this, one of the tragic things, is that the Jews have been waiting for a promised descendant of David for 1,000 years. But now he's standing right beside them, and they don't recognize him for who he is. So could you be in the same position? In a way, you're standing beside Jesus tonight. You're hearing his teaching in church. You're spending time with his people. But do you recognize who he is? That he is not just someone who lived in the past, but your only hope of getting to heaven. Do you realize that he has the authority to call the shots in your life? To sweep aside your own ideas about the best way to live and call you back to his word. If it's a missed opportunity to stand beside Prince William and not recognize him, what would it be to be so close to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the Prince of Peace, even just once, and not to recognize him for who he is, just to keep on living as if nothing had happened? But it doesn't have to be that way. Perhaps you're starting to realize that Jesus is the one you've been waiting for. All your life there's been a void, an emptiness that nothing could seem to fill. But as St. Augustine said many years ago, as he prayed, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you." Jesus is the one you've been looking for, even if you haven't even realized that you've been looking. Don't make the mistake of the Pharisees. He was right there among them, and they couldn't see him for who he really was. But then the second major dangerous mistake we see in these verses, the second one for tonight, the fifth and final one we'll look at today, is already having your mind made up. Already having your mind made up. Has someone ever come to you for advice, but it soon becomes clear, either then and there or in the days that follow, that they already have had their mind made up? That though they've asked for your opinion, nothing that you could say is going to change their mind. It's not going to make any difference. They came and asked a question, but their mind was already made up. Well, in verses 6 through 11 here, we see people who already have their minds made up, and no amount of evidence is going to change it. In verse 6, Jesus goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath. He's in God's house on God's day. It's not the place where you would expect him to face opposition, but it's actually where he faces his fiercest critics. And that should make us sit up and take notice. Maybe we assume that if we're in church, then we must be some of the few people who are getting Jesus right. That others who are doing other things tonight, that they're the ones getting Jesus wrong. But we must be getting him right because we're here. But once again, we see the strongest opposition to Jesus coming from people who were within the church. People who thought that they were okay the way they were and didn't react well to someone who told them otherwise. Who had their traditions and routines and didn't want a disruptor coming along and challenging any of that. And as Jesus enters the synagogue, a man with a withered hand is there. In particular, it's his right hand. Notice how specific it is. The Bible is a book of facts. It's true history. It's not myth. Maybe this man came every week. Maybe some have suggested he's a plant of the Pharisees, that they've brought him along deliberately to see what Jesus will do. But either way, the air is full of tension. The Pharisees want Jesus to heal. Isn't that great? They want Jesus to heal this man. Well, actually, it's not great, because they don't care about the man at all. They simply want an opportunity to accuse Jesus. It's spelled out for us, verse 7, so they might find a reason to accuse him. How wicked is that? That's the level that opposing Jesus can reduce people to. Wanting to see someone miraculously healed, just to use him as a reason so that they can kill Jesus. And again, it's not that by healing the man, Jesus would be breaking God's law. But the Jewish add-ons to God's law said that first aid on the Sabbath was only permissible to prevent an injury from worsening. That if somebody had got injured and got hurt, and if it was going to get worse and worse, then you could take the first aid box down and you could help them. But if it wasn't going to get any worse, if you could wait until another day, then you just had to wait. It would be regarded as work, and you'd have to wait until the Sabbath was over. And so Jesus asked them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And their silence condemns them. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus will spell it out, Matthew 12, verse 11. Which of you who has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And it's perhaps not just the Pharisees who get this wrong. We've tended to talk in Reformed circles about works of necessity and mercy being exceptions to the fourth commandment in the sense of, well, you can do them if you really need to. But William Symington, who was minister here 200 years ago, challenged that view. He said, not only is the performance of these not a sin, but it would be a sin to omit them. Not only does the person employed in discharging them commit no breach of the Sabbath, but a breach of the law would be chargeable on the one who willfully neglected them. He says the things themselves are not merely things that we may do, but which we must do, being required by God himself. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but do you see what he's saying? He's saying that the person who contents themselves that they're keeping the Sabbath just because they don't do things isn't actually keeping it. And I think the same point is captured in the title of a recent book on the Lord's Day by an American RP minister, Daniel Howe. The title is Worship, Feasting, Rest and Mercy. What's the Sabbath about? Well, the book title tells you worship, feasting, rest and mercy. Leave out mercy, leave out any input into the lives of other people on the Sabbath. Leave out encouraging others, leave out helping others, leave out serving others in some way, and you've actually broken it. And so Jesus asks them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? The answer is pretty obvious. But in their stubbornness and hard-heartedness, they refuse to answer. How does Jesus react? Well, Mark tells us in his gospel that he is angry with them. The real Jesus of the Bible gets angry. And what makes him angry here isn't outright opposition, but hardness of heart from the outwardly respectable. And as soon as Jesus heals him, the Pharisees immediately go out and plot to kill him, as Mark also spells out in his gospel. So we've looked at 5 major mistakes today that people make about Jesus, but they're not just 5 sort of random, completely separate events, but instead there's a progression, there's an intensification until we reach this point where they're ready to kill him. Because your attitude to Jesus, it's not something that will stay still. It will either soften to him, your heart will become softer to Jesus and more receptive to his teaching as time goes on, if you react well to him and take on board what he's saying. Or your heart will harden and you'll become more and more entrenched in your unbelief. Maybe you come and think, oh, well, maybe there is something in this. Maybe I should think seriously about becoming a Christian, but you don't, and you put it off, and you put it off, and each time then you hear the gospel, you feel less ready to do that. Your heart becomes harder and harder. So do you come to church with your mind already made up? Do you read the Bible with your mind already made up? Do you think that you already have the answers to the big questions of life sorted? Yes, it might be nice to add on a little bit of religion, but that's all it'll be. It'll just be an add-on. Well, those that the Bible commends aren't those who come with their minds made up, or those who blindly accept what the minister says, but those who examine the Scriptures to make sure that what they've gone through their lives believing is actually right. So Jesus heals the man, and immediately the Pharisees begin to discuss with one another what they might do to him. One of the tragic things is that phrase in verse 11, one another, is often used for how we should act with our fellow Christians, what we should do for them, to love one another, serve one another, encourage one another, and so on. But if we aren't living out the right one another's, we'll begin living out the wrong one another's. And they discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So there's a hardening, there's an intensification of their opposition to Jesus. And yet, just as we finished tonight, even that was part of the plan. Another major mistake about Jesus would be to see the cross as unplanned, as a tragic but unintended outcome. Whereas Jesus was born in order that he might die. He came into this world in order that he might go to the cross. And all that human and demonic opposition could do was fulfill that plan. So how do you react to who Jesus is and what he's done on the cross? Where you will spend eternity hangs on that question. Amen. Well, we turn now to sing Psalm 34, and we know, again, from the title in our Bibles, that it was written just shortly after the incident in David's life that we've thought about tonight. And we're going to sing from verse 9 on page 64, and tune number 185. Psalm 34, verses 9 through 14, starting on page 64. Verse 10, the Lord has set his face against all those who do wickedly. And the thing about the passage that we've been looking at tonight is that those who did wickedly, they weren't those who were out there killing people necessarily, at least not at this point, but they were those who were opposing Jesus. There is such a thing as quiet opposition. And then verse 14 sums up their attitude. That second line of verse 14, all those who hate the just are condemned. And doesn't that sum up those we've thought about today? They hated the just. They hated Jesus, the truly righteous man, and they stood condemned. And so may we take warning from them and react rightly to Jesus and his claims on our lives. So Psalm 34, 9 to 14, we'll stand to sing praise.